Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm a program coordinator at Search for Common Ground, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the Washington Network on Children and Armed Conflict. We have with us John Williamson from the Displaced Children Orphans Fund of USAID and Jessica Lenz from Interaction. So I'll turn it over to John now just to give a little bit of information about WINCAT.
Surprisingly, we are 12 years old now. We started in 2004 as a forum to bring people together in the Washington area and now globally through the internet, people concerned with children in armed conflict. So we bring together people from government, NGOs, people from academia, and consultants. What we recognized, Michael Chipler and I first started, was people tended to not have opportunities necessarily to meet people out of their particular organizational silos. So we wanted to provide a venue, a forum for that to happen, for exchange, networking, and hopefully collaboration. So just a little bit of background on WINCAT. And again, I'm John Williamson. I'm a Displaced Children Orphans Fund at USAID, and DCOF and Search for Common Ground have been the organizers of WINCAT since 2004. So we very quickly want to go around and let everybody introduce themselves. We all know who's in the room, and we are being telecast on the internet, so if anybody has concerns about that and you want not to be on camera, you can come up here.
Come to the side.
So let's just go around and introduce ourselves.
Sure, I'm Anna Windsor. I work for Wellspring Advisors. We're a funder in the international children's rights space. One of our 3 areas of focus is children in armed conflict.
I'm Kathy Savino. I work at AID with John, and I focus on the Victims of Torture Fund.
Hi, I'm Jillian Hiss. I'm currently seeking out my next opportunity in the international development or peace building space.
Leslie Wingender. I'm with Mercy Corps, and I'm on the Peace and Conflict team.
Blake Crafts. I work here at Search for Communications Department.
Chalake from Cameroon. I'm an intern here in 2 weeks. I work in peace and security and fight against violent extremism back in Cameroon.
I'm Dean Ravita. I'm a professor in health and sports sciences and research practitioner at the Boston Center for Conflict Resolution at Salisbury University. And I examined, been doing field work and research in the uses of sport for children in armed conflict for quite some time now.
Hi, I'm Laura Lloyd-Braff. I'm a technical advisor for resource mobilization with Child Fund International. I work in their emergency management.
Hi everyone, my name is Ella Duncan, and I work here at Search on the Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Peace program.
I'm Anna. I am currently an intern with the Design, Monitoring, program.
I'm Rachad. I'm an intern here at Search on the Global Affairs and Partnerships team.
I'm Liz. I'm also an intern, and I'm working with strategic development.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Goldmanson. I was most recently the protection coordinator for the Danish Refugee Council in Jordan, and also the protection working group.
Hi, I'm Blair. I'm an intern this summer for the Global Campaign for Education in the next chapter.
Hi, I'm Henry McNulty with Mercy Corps, the protection advisor.
Hi, I'm Maggie Smiley. I'm the Child Protection Advisor at Child Fund on the team with Laura in Strategic Management.
Hi.
Kelsey Hampton with the Humanitarian team at Interaction.
Hi, Lee McCarthy, and I work on result-based protection with Jessica at Interaction.
And I'm going to turn it now for Saji to introduce himself. He's with us on Google Hangouts.
Hi, everyone. This is Saji Prelis with Search for Common Ground. It's really nice to see some familiar faces also in the room. And John, happy birthday to the 12th anniversary of WINCAT. Really glad to be here.
Thanks, Saji. All right, well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jessica. She is a senior program manager for protection at Interaction. and leads the results-based protection program and the work on gender-based violence at Interaction. She has over 17 years of experience working in child protection and emergencies in Uganda, Sudan, Liberia, many locations around the world. And she is the author of numerous studies, tools, and guidance on child protection, and most recently a contributing author in the soon-to-be-released book, Working with Children Affected by Armed Violence Theory, Method, and Practice.
I'm excited to be here, and I know several of you I haven't seen in a while, so good to have you here. So some of this might be repetitive to those of you in the protection community who've been following results-based protection, but really I'm excited that we have other actors here beyond the protection community and really engaging the peace-building actors, academics, those that are in other sectors beyond protection children, so others that are in education or in the area of focus. Because what we start to talk about in terms of results-based protection is really engaging multiple actors to solve a problem. So I'm excited for this, for who's in the room, and I hope we can have a really good discussion. I'm going to start off with giving a bit of a background of what is results-based protection, and that will kind of lead us into probably more of a richer discussion, and I can share then some practical examples in terms of what results-based protection looks like in the field and when you're trying to solve a protection issue. We come to this looking at all protection. So I will focus specifically for this group here to look at child protection, but the concepts and the key elements that I talk about are actually looking at all types of protection beyond children as well. So you can use the same methods. So I have a fun Prezi for us, so which is the one that I press. You should just be able to click in it. Okay. Which one? The left. Oh, the left. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to kind of go back a little bit. So Interaction, through our protection working group, started to look at protection and thinking through how do you measure protection outcomes and what does that actually mean about 4 to 5 years ago. And it really came from this, I guess, this overwhelming urge from our community that we couldn't measure protection and that it was too difficult and that we relied too much on our outputs. So looking at our activities like trainings or child-friendly spaces and things that we often do in terms of activities, but we don't know whether or not those activities actually lead to an actual reduction of risk, whether it's for child protection or other concerns. And so you found in our community the last 5 or 6 more years that people were raising questions of there is no evidence, we focus too much on training, we look at our service provision, so we focus a lot on helping survivors, but we don't actually do a lot in actually stopping the risk from the beginning. And then there's the whole other piece that no one understands what we do. So particularly when you come from the protection world, beyond child protection, I think is a little bit better there. But protection, everyone's like, what is protection? What does that actually mean? So there's lots and lots of confusion about what we're actually doing. And so this led Interaction and through our protection working group to really start having a better sense of what are actors doing, how can we better improve our programming so that we can actually achieve protection outcomes. So through various consultations, we were able to kind of get a sense of what people were actually measuring. What were they actually trying to do in order to change risk? And this is just coming from the NGO community and kind of what we found, but it's very similar to how donors see things as well. So we looked at multiple actors, but I'm just going to show you the pie chart here from the NGO community. But basically what we found was around 21% of actors really saw that if you were able to change knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, that would lead to a reduction of risk. Whereas 29% saw it around change of policy or practice. Others felt that that it was actually more about empowering people themselves. So if people started to take up different initiatives or approaches to protect themselves, then that was a sign that risk was being reduced. And then others saw it was the whole thing. It was a combination of all this. It was the full system, that you needed all of that to actually create change. So as much as there were some differences here, in a sense, we were actually all on the same page in terms of how we were thinking about protection. I'm going to struggle with that. That's okay. But ultimately, within as we started to really look at this and explore through various consultations and holding various roundtables with multiple actors, we really came to a common agreement that what we were trying to measure then were and results were actually then described as a change in attitude, a change in behavior, a change in practice, and change in policy. And that we did come to an agreement that a protection outcome is the reduction of risk, and that is what we're aiming for. So I know there's lots of confusion in the community oftentimes when you start to talk about outcomes, and some people will actually describe a protection outcome as a change in policy. And we go beyond that. We say, no, well, that's a part of it, that's an intermediate result, but we need to actually look at whether or not a change of policy actually leads to a change in the risk that children or others are actually facing. And so in order to do that, we then need to measure the reductions in risk and track those specific changes in policy and practices, attitudes, behavior, in order to determine whether or not risk was actually going down. So this was at least a common framework that we could at least go with and then start to explore, well, how do you do this? And ultimately, and I won't go into the full background, what we've identified then are three fundamental, or what we say key elements that support a results-based approach to protection. And what we mean by a key element is that it's the necessary action that is needed to be able to achieve a measurable result. And so in each part of, as you start to do analysis, as you start to do program design, and thinking through, even through implementation, these elements need to be present. You need to have this. It's not just a one-off activity. It's something that needs to be continuous. And the elements get to the heart of problem solving. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to solve a problem and trying to get back and help us get back to basic problem solving techniques and methods. And so the first question we ask ourselves is, do you know what problem you are trying to solve? It's fundamental, because oftentimes we come in and we have some general thinking, but we actually don't know the very specific problem we're trying to deal with. We may be looking at child soldiers, and I'm going in to solve the problem of child soldiers, but how does that look like in this community, in this particular country context, by these people and the different actors that are engaged? So it's, do you really know the problem you're trying to solve? And then, do you know where you're going and actually how you will problem solve? So what methods are you using? Not the activities. So not that I'm coming in with a child-friendly space and that's going to solve the problem, but what are the methods you're going to actually use to start to think about that context-specific analysis that I'll talk about in a minute, start to be able to understand your problem better, how you're engaging with different affected populations. So what are those methods and tools that are going to help you design your program better? And then recognizing as well that it takes more than one actor to solve a problem. And particularly when we're talking about child protection, it's not just child protection actors that can solve the problem. So it's multiple actors, and it's thinking about all those different actors who come together. So these are the questions that surround our elements, and now I just want to explore those elements with you in a little bit more depth. So our first one is what we call is context-specific protection analysis. And what this is being able to understand the specific risk patterns that people experience as far as possible from the perspective of the affected population, and recognizing what efforts they're doing, and that what we can actually do to be able to avoid risk, and then measure our programs against those specific patterns. So not coming in with generalizations. And yes, it's okay to have our quick rapid assessments, which many of us do, particularly in a crisis setting, but we need to go beyond that. We need to be able to understand, You know, certainly we're going to go into whatever country. I mean, we just came back from Colombia, so to kind of build on this is that we were looking at the issue of child recruitment and the use of children, and had we only looked at it from that level, we would not be able to understand the different dynamics and the different patterns that were going on even in one community. So we even narrowed it down to one state, to one community, and in that one community, there were different patterns, like multiple different patterns about how children were being used and recruited. But if we came in with our generalization, we would not be able to solve that problem. And so it's helping us move away from our generalizations and helping us get very specific, very detailed, disaggregate the issues beyond just age, sex, gender, etc. But what are the time of day that people are affected? What ethnicity? You know, who's specifically affected? Is it children living in single-headed households? Is it single-headed households in one particular community? And in that community only at the time of 6 o'clock to 12 p.m. You know, so it's really breaking it down so you can see the specific pattern. Our second element is what we call as outcome-oriented methods. And I still think this doesn't quite make sense when we say it. People are like, what is that? But it's really getting to the tools, the methods that we're using, getting away from our standard list of activities. So you shouldn't open up a book and say, how do I solve the recruitment of children in armed conflict? Here are the list of activities I should do. Move away from that, but use methods that can help you problem solve, help you think about how you solve a specific problem in that community. And so we really talk a lot about here is move away from your predefined activities and predefined vulnerabilities and think about using a causal logic. So how do you understand your response in relation to the actual patterns of risk? What are you actually trying to do? What are your assumptions around that? And are you questioning your assumptions? What are the methods that you're using that will allow you to engage with affected populations that can help you think through your problem solving? And what does that two-way dialogue look like? Who controls information in a community? How do you engage those individuals so that you get more information to help you understand how to solve the problem? So it's really thinking about the methods and the tools in this situation that can help you be adaptable, to be flexible, to be iterative, and that's a core piece of a results-based approach. And so we can talk more about what those look like and what we've identified, but that's the next one. So the last one is designing for contribution. And this is really getting at the heart of the problem solving as well, that it's not just us, not just protection actors, child protection actors that will solve the problem, but that we need to be able to understand who else is out there, what other actors are necessary, what other beyond humanitarian actors, for example. So across sectors, across disciplinaries. So what about development actors? What about peace-building actors? Or academics? Where do they sit? How do we engage them? And not only looking at that, but at what level? So are we looking at actors that only engage at the individual family level? Where's their value? How can we engage them? What about those that are working at the national level or international level? I'm looking at the different levels and sectors. And recognizing that all of us in a different way are contributing to the problem, or to be able to reduce the problem. But how do we come together? How do we do that better? How do we collaborate? How do we synergize? How do we recognize those linkages? Because we're all doing it. It's not that we're not doing it, but we often don't come together and measure how each other's work actually affects somebody else's work. So, so this is a core element. So these are our three elements: analysis, the methods, the contribution. And what we've recognized is having those three help us approach or help us basically measure changes in patterns of threat, vulnerability, and capacity. And I talk about those because in protection, the way we understand protection, and this is child protection as well, these are the component parts of risk. So if you ever see some of those diagrams that say risk equals threat plus or over vulnerability, capacity, et cetera, these are the pieces that we're trying to measure. We're trying to see whether or not the threat goes down, the vulnerability goes down, and the capacity goes up. And that combination should ultimately lead in a reduction of risk. So we're looking at those as it then relates to the change, as I said, the intermediate results, the change of policy, behavior, practice, and attitudes, ultimately to see reduction of risk. But what we're not saying is that this is it. So you still have to have your fundamental ways that you actually do your programming. So we call these enablers, and this is probably what many of you, particularly in the protection humanitarian community, know very well. These are making sure that our standards are upheld. So our basic standards, in terms of really solid coordination, thinking about our principles. So we're not taking away like the issues of certainly international humanitarian law and all of the principles around humanitarian, but also principles like confidentiality, do no harm, the best interest of the child. These principles need to be upheld as well. And having accountability to affected populations, this is still critical in your programming and your design, as well as protection mainstreaming, which we would say is pretty much safe programming, so ensuring that your program doesn't contribute to additional harm that children may be experiencing. And organizational policies need to be in place to ensure that all of this can actually take place and actually happen, and that you can have a strong response. And fundamentally, the leadership, a strong leadership in order to be able to guide a response, a collective response that allows you to achieve a protection outcome. So these are all the fundamental things that we are doing, we're trying to improve as a whole, as our entire community. So we're not touching on those specifically, we're really focusing in on the elements to enhance those elements. And again, the way we're doing this is not in isolation. So it is through the entire program cycle. So you would look at analysis, that context-specific analysis throughout, and what I'm showing you here is the humanitarian program cycle for those of you that aren't familiar. So it begins obviously through needs assessments, strategy planning, resource mobilization, implementation, monitoring, and peer review and evaluation. This is basically what has come out of the Interagency Standing Committee work on humanitarian programs. So this is the humanitarian program cycle. So we would be looking at each element through that whole piece, as well as our outcome-oriented methods. How are you using that throughout your program cycle? And the contribution, what does that look like through every step of the way? So I wanted to take you a little bit in terms of what this looks like then in practice. So let's take the example of child recruitment. What we would need to do first is really understand then that specific context, what's going on with those children in that particular community. And you would be analyzing it based off of the capacity, the vulnerabilities, and the threat. And I highlight the threat because it's a piece that often is skipped and missed entirely, especially from the humanitarian community. But recognizing that you need all three to understand all three to be able to solve the problem. So let's say we broke that down and we recognized that in a particular country or particular area that it was, let's say, boys between the age of, 12 to 17 who were the most at risk of being recruited. They may be being recruited by a particular armed group who was not following basic standards or international humanitarian law. And so we're recognizing then what is our logic then behind in terms of responding and trying to solve this problem. We would start to look at, again, the multiple levels, multidisciplinary, and multiple actors that are needed to then solve this problem based off of our core analysis. And this is a very random example, but let's just say what we need to do first is noticing that we need to uphold respect for norms, international humanitarian norms. And we might be able to break it down to be able to say that we need to establish regular dialogue with non-state armed groups. We need to invoke a sense of accountability to civilian populations. And we need to use international accountability mechanisms to develop incentives for adherence to basic norms. This would just give us a starting point. This would be, and what we would do is we would start looking through our assumptions that surround this. We would look at what are the resources, who are the different actors that are engaging on this already, how do we support that, how do we build on that, to really be able to understand then what is needed next. And as basically you go would then say, if that is met, what would be the next piece along that causal logic or that pathway? And maybe that is establishing a dialogue then directly with those armed groups who are recruiting children. And what might that look like? What would that entail? And you would break that down. You would look at your assumptions again around that. Who are the different actors contributing to that? What are the different methods that you can use to engage in a dialogue, et cetera? And ultimately, maybe then you're reaching IHL in the sense that, okay, we've established that dialogue, now we need to, they don't understand it, maybe we need to do trainings around this. And so we're speaking with those actors directly, we're training them on different issues, and hopefully that would start to lead in perhaps a change in practice. Okay, this is very broad, it's a lot more than that, but you'd be looking at this in terms of the threat, as well as the vulnerability at the same time, and capacity. And ultimately putting all three of those pathways together to be able to understand what intermediate results you're trying to change, and look at whether or not you're changing practice, policy, attitudes, behavior, and sort of knowledge is another piece people put in. But you're looking at that against how you measure change in terms of risk. So is the threat going down? Is vulnerability going down? Is capacity going up? As it relates back to the intermediate results and the actions that you've identified as part of your causal logic. And that hopefully should help you to be able to measure or not whether or not you are achieving outcomes. And this would be very specific. It wouldn't just be the reduction of children in armed groups. It would be very specific. This isn't very specific, but it's a little bit. So you'd break that down to be able to understand the specific patterns. But the reason why we say this is very iterative is that in order to do that, you need to be able to go back again to your analysis again to see whether or not the environment has changed, whether or not your approach has changed, what are the patterns, have those changed? So again, each time you are, what we look at is more of like a star. So as much as the program cycle kind of has you go in this kind of circle, because results-based protection is so iterative, and it's so important that you have continuous analysis and that you're using your different methods and you're understanding the dynamics and the changes with relationships and patterns, is that you have to review, you have to be able to be adaptive and flexible enough so that your program can actually also see the changes and you can adapt quickly enough as well. So, so we look at it more as like a star in that sense. So again, that would be the humanitarian program cycle, which we're still using, that's still pretty standard, but using a more results-based approach, we're saying start with your analysis, think through your causal logic before you just start in with your specific actions. Then thinking through the action that you are going to take and measuring that against the results that you're looking for. So again, are you seeing an actual change in patterns of threat, vulnerability, capacity in relation to the outcome that you're trying to achieve? But to do that, again, back to analysis again. So you're constantly going back and forth. That is a really quick overview. There's a lot more details, but I just wanted to kind of put that, at least get the base right now, a foundation for what we're talking about, what we mean by results-based protection. And I thought I'd take maybe some clarifying questions at the moment before I talk about some actual examples and some field examples for where we've just been, for example, in Colombia. And also it would be great to hear from the Peacebuilding community that's here as well, as that whether or not you see some commonalities or similarities or differences in terms of how you look at peacebuilding and trying to achieve the outcomes that you're after, and whether or not they're the same. Because what we've found, at least in our work, is there's a lot of connection here. There's a lot of intersection, and the challenges and opportunities are very similar. And although our outcome might be different, our approach is often very similar. And so how can we learn from each other and engage from each other? So I'd open up the floor now at this moment for a couple of questions, if I was too quick or if I didn't make any sense at all.
You said that you were going to provide some examples, because I'd like to hear an example sometime down the road, if you have it, of how you did kind of utilize that reflective cycle, if you will, or whatever,
Sure.
where you needed to, where you saw some change and then you needed to be able to adapt to the context or whatever. So I'd be interested to hear if you have, if you have that'd be great.
Do you want me to take questions one at a time, or take a couple?
Entirely up to you. And I'd suggest we just limit questions to clarification at this point, because we do have some substantive discussion that we need to do some other stuff.
And for those of you online, if you have questions, you can type them in and I can read them out. And if we don't have any questions right now, then maybe it would be helpful to have the peace building perspective. And I have my colleagues from Search for Common Ground here. So Saji, do you want to just say a bit, and then we'll have Ella?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for the lovely presentation. As I was listening to you, I was kind of confused, because I was wondering if this is a peace building presentation or a child protection presentation. I wasn't quite sure, because the intersections, the language you were using, the methods and the approaches you were talking about were very similar for us who are working in the peace building sector also, so you rightly alluded to. I'll be very brief. I just want to make a couple of things. One, I think, is for us when we approach this by young people, for a peace building lens, we are trying to look at what's the role of young people in conflict, and how do you transform their role so they actually can help shape a better environment for them, so that the violence and risks reduce, so that they actually can play a more active role in their society. So from that lens, when we look at this, the child protection community's work and the peace building community's work really intersect. But I think the key lesson I learned from listening to you is we use different words, we use different language for this. And sometimes, but the approaches, the methods are very similar in spirit and intent. I think one, what I heard a lot about is the systems approach, working collaboratively. I think in the peace building community also, at the very beginning, in its evolution, we've come a long way, by the way, but we have this notion that, for example, Search, our mission is to transform the way the world deals with conflict and violent conflict. And we used to think that we can do it by ourselves. And it's rather arrogant, but I think we've learned the hard way that we alone cannot do it by ourselves. I think as a field, as a peace building field, we've also learned that we cannot, and we have to collaborate and understand how to work across agencies to do this. And that's a big evolution for us all. I think in that idea, and we're really looking at from a peace building sense, where the role children and young people can play in the peace building process. Can young people also play a role in reducing violence, besides just being seen as victims of violence itself? And I think in that sense, from a peace building, using a peace building lens, we've seen a lot of progress made. Because, as you said, I hinted at, when violence affects young people, it has lifelong consequences to them and to therefore to the society at large as well. So for us, when we engage young people to be actually the peace builders, enabling them to be peace builders, there's a lot of evidence now that they actually are more likely to be involved with peace building activities as they get older also. So that's where the evidence is. So I'm actually interested in getting into the examples that you were going to share, Jessica. But the main point for me is that there's a lot of coherence between the two, child protection and peace building community. And the more we actually, synchronize our work, the better outcomes we will have, because ultimately the outcome is reducing risk, having better relationships with one another, so that the policy and practice becomes far more accountable to the populations we serve. So a really good presentation. I'm really looking forward to the discussion further.
Thank you, Saji. And Ella, did you want to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica, for a great presentation. Yeah, so I'm here representing DMNE for Peace, and Saji did a great segue into what I want to say. Just DMNE for Peace is a project of Search, but it's a kind of whole of field approach to evidence. and to lessons and to tools around how do we learn what's working, what's not, how do we be honest about that, and really to understand why, not just for peace building, but anything to do with peace and development. And so with that in mind, I mean, it's a project that focuses, the goal is to build capacity and hold and build transparency, to hold the field accountable, essentially, and kind of share what we're learning. And with that in mind, I mean, it's great to hear about your perspective, Jessica, and, you know, to my mind, just running through like all these different examples, kind of what Saji was saying of things we can pull from here to peace building. And so just there is, I would really highly recommend that, you know, everyone here takes a moment. There's a few flyers, but DB for Peace is a place that, you know, we're trying to share evidence. So if anyone's interested in looking at what evidence is there. So Saji just mentioned that, you know, there are now like longer term studies that are coming out showing that being engaged with youth in peace building activities or peace and development activities has long-term effects. And the thing that immediately came to mind was Seeds with Peace. I don't know if you're familiar. It's an organization that began bringing Palestinian and Israeli youth together in a third space, Maine, go northeast. And what they're finding now is that they've been looking back, and 20 years later, they're able to see that there are explicit, so their participants in this program are explicitly involved in peace building, and in really high numbers. Like, and what they're looking at now is, what about people who are more tacitly involved in peace building? Like, if you're working in a traditional field like media, but are you taking the peace journalism approach? And so it's really exciting to look at what happens when you engage with youth. And what I would say is that a lot of interesting evidence and experience around evaluation in this space with youth is around participation. And I know that Saji could probably speak a little bit on this as well. There was last year, 3M, I always forget the M's, multi-agency, multi-country, multi-donor evaluation in Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nepal. And the space that they gave the youth participants there to help define the terms of their own evaluation were really exciting. And to think about the kind of sharing that's happening there, like what we're learning from education and humanitarian work and how that's coming together in this specific example in peace building. But also I'm really excited to hear, and I might jump in again later, but to hear from Jessica the examples. And so I don't want to dig too deeply into this, but around what are the challenges of participation? You know, how do you find that balance between you want to be as flexible and responsive as possible, but also acknowledging that every time you add a question or add an element, I had a great example that it's like a pyramid, right? You think that you're just adding one little space, but you have to build it all the way around the base and all the way up. And so all of a sudden you're creating this huge amount of work. If you think about adding one more question to a data set, you're adding translation, you're adding training, you're adding analysis, and then what are you going to do with that? And so thinking through, I think this is such an important conversation about not just what evidence are we getting, but how are we using it? So I'm really excited to hear this, and I would be really encourage everyone to take a look at DB for Peace. There's also specifically a community on education and peace building, which I think is really relevant to this group, and to think through, especially a lot of things have been coming out of a PDA UNICEF project recently. So yeah, I look forward to the examples, and so I'll stop there.
And I will speak to the reflection piece of it, but you know what's interesting, and I think my colleagues in the back can also say to it, is that a lot of our examples on reflection actually come from the peace building community. We've learned more from the peace building community about how to do reflection better than the humanitarian community. So you might already know those examples. But I just, I wanted to share a little bit then in terms of what some of this looks like in practice and what we are doing. So just to give you a sense too, so we're not at the stage of training yet, and not even really promoting the results-based approach to its entirety yet. We are still in this exploratory mode still. We are still learning. And this is why we have these discussions with like here with the Washington Network, with other actors, and it's why we've been going to the field, to different country contexts to get the perspective from the field to understand, does this make sense? How do you apply some of this? What does this look like? And so it is still this iterative process, even as we develop the results-based protection framework, and what it looks like and what works and what doesn't. And so just to keep that in mind as I talk about some of the examples and what we've been able to find. sure it's right on the, every time I move it, it goes somewhere else. Okay. Okay, so we're still very new in the sense of going out and really looking at this in practice, but we have been able to look at and trying to document results-based protection and those key elements in 3 specific countries most recently. We've done a couple of other visits, but those were more, I would say, consultative. But these ones we were actually working with the actors on the ground and helping them think through a results-based approach and how they can apply in strengthening their approaches to achieve protection outcomes. And so we've been to Colombia just recently, just a month ago, in Lebanon and also in Myanmar. So I just want to very briefly, and I'm mostly going to speak on Colombia, but we can talk about the other 2 as well if there's examples there. But our purpose really for going there is to identify those practical applications of the key elements, because we do believe that they're happening. They're out there. People are using them. Agencies are using them, but they don't always use them consistently, and sometimes it's very ad hoc, and you might find it happening in one organization at one field level, but not across the entire country, or maybe not even across the entire globe in terms of how that organization, their reach is. So we want to be able to identify those and better document them. And in that process, while we go to do all that, that's certainly for our benefit, for the program of results-based protection, but we want to be able to help those actors on the ground immediately. And so our approach has been, as much as we're learning still, we're also giving back. And we're engaging with the different actors, not just humanitarians, although that tends to be where it starts, but we try to bring in multiple actors together so that they can then learn as well and teach us, but also strengthen their approach going forward. So we have been also very much involved after the fact. So once we leave a country, there's a lot more follow-on in terms of helping them and guide them in terms of taking some of this forward. So our field visits, and just to give you specifics, because as you heard me in the original presentation, we do look at the details. So that's so critical for understanding how to problem solve. And so when we went to these 3 areas, we looked at very different protection issues. We weren't just looking at protection broadly. We weren't just looking at child protection broadly. We were looking at something very specific. And each time it was those countries who were allowing us, and they were identifying the issue that we should explore. So this wasn't coming from us. It was them, the countries themselves, the actors on the ground saying, we don't understand this. We need to get better at it. We need to figure out a better response. So in Colombia, we started with the protection cluster in Colombia, and they identified the issue of child recruitment and the use of children by armed groups. Then they narrowed that down even further to a particular location. And just for sensitivity issues, I'm not going to reveal that, just given how complex the issues and stuff are in Colombia. But we identified a particular state where we went, and then they identified specific communities within that state, or what they call the departments in Colombia, those of you familiar with Colombia. So it really narrowed it down so that we could then focus in on the specific patterns of risk that were happening around child recruitment and the use of children in that context. So that's what we were doing in Colombia. In Lebanon, we were looking then at outcome-oriented methods and really looking at program design and how the actors there were responding to eviction. And that was, again, something that they were looking at. And a follow-on after we left Lebanon and they were able to engage with us and understand results-based protection, we then engaged a little bit further from afar on gender-based violence and working with the group, the GBB working, or GBB, yeah, it would have been a working group because there's no cluster there, in terms of some of the things that they were thinking about specifically around engaging men and boys on addressing gender-based violence and how they could use a results-based approach to do that. And so that was a piece there. And then in Myanmar, when we went out there, we were specifically looking at how they could strengthen their analysis. They had done some really good, actually, context analysis, conflict analysis, actually, coming from, I think, the Peacebuilding community. They didn't really know how to take that. They didn't know what to do with that. And they actually were not doing a very good analysis on the ground in terms of really unpacking the vulnerability, the capacities, and the threats. And so they needed further guidance on how to do that. And this was right at the time as well when a lot of discussion was going on around the centrality of protection. For those of you who may or may not be aware of this, but this is a movement within the humanitarian community to ensure that protection is at the center of all humanitarian response, and that it's core to everything we do, even if you're shelter or wash or whatever, is that how are you addressing protection as an outcome, not just doing your program safe, but how are you actually addressing the issues that people are facing. And so they wanted to ensure that their analysis was strong enough so that not only for the protection cluster, they could also help to shape the overall humanitarian response. So those are 3 countries that we went to explore and to engage a little bit further. What we do when we're in the field is several steps. And this has been kind of a trial and error on our part as well, just to determine what works, how do we engage best, what the field appreciates, and how we can support it. So each time for us, it's also a learning opportunity. But we generally, as Interaction, we're an outside actor. We are not an implementing organization, we're not operational, but our members are. So we have over 200 members, so certainly we are engaging with those members. But we are also not necessarily neutral, but we are able to play a part when we come to a country as an outside actor to be able to bring other people together and to engage them in a way that perhaps somebody on the ground, like the protection cluster coordinator, can't always do given the dynamics that are going on there, or the government or whoever, what other actors are there. So as an outside actor, we're actually often welcomed. I mean, very much welcome to please come out, please bring these actors together to share ideas. So we engage actors in these workshops and the roundtables around results-based protection. We start this dialogue with multiple different actors, going beyond the humanitarian actors, so including peace builders, development actors, academics, and bringing them together. And one of the things that we've started to do is then develop, so if we were looking at, for example, the case in Colombia and looking at child recruitment, we have been able to develop a timeline of milestones in terms of what those actors in country, not just humanitarian, but all, have been doing in order to try to change policy, change practice, change behavior and attitudes as it relates to child recruitment. And so we kind of put this together from afar and then validate it once we're in the field and add to it. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. But this really helps us to help them start to develop their own causal logic. Because what we find most often is that most actors don't have any logic. Well, they have a general logic or assumptions, but it's not a logic that allows them to really test out their assumptions. It really, everyone says, oh, well, a child-friendly space, you need this because it's going to solve, it's going to take away risk. But that's about it. And they're not looking at it in that relation to that context and what's there. And so really helping them to break that down a little bit more. And so part of that we help them do. At the same time, then we're providing recommendations based off of our trip with them so that they can improve their approach, build on the elements that they're doing really well, and even strengthen them. And then it allows us, again, to document and find opportunities where we could return and maybe actually build up a case study to share what that really looks like in practice. So that's kind of what we've been doing when we go to the field. I don't know why every time I touch it, it moves. Okay, so this is I wanted to just share them from Colombia, the examples in terms of what we did. This is some of the timelines and milestones that we put together, and this is not comprehensive, and this is just a snapshot. But we certainly did, prior to even arriving, doing a full analysis and trying to understand the context from a broader view. And then once in country, we were able to dive in even deeper to understand the specifics and the specific patterns in those locations. So on the top here, you see in the dark blue, kind of poverty protection. These are all kind of the analysis, the big picture kind of analysis pieces. But what we're really interested in is then, if you're trying to reduce risk, and ultimately reducing children from being used and recruited by armed groups in a particular location by specific children, what is the change of policy, practice, attitudes, and behavior that's influencing that change? And how do we know whether or not vulnerability, capacity, and threat is actually being affected or not? So we've put together a snapshot as much as we can about some of the different milestones that have been achieved. So in the context of Colombia, for example, you might have seen that In 2005, the government signs the optional protocol on children in armed conflict. That's a huge milestone. And behind that, there's actually a list of activities by different actors across different fields that actually helped make that happen, right? And so we're also looking at that. So all you see here are the actual milestones. But in addition to that, we have then what we were able to do is go through all the various actions that accompany each of those milestones and look at those actions as it relates to, were they trying to affect vulnerability, capacity, or threat in that type of action? What level were they trying to address? Were they focused in on the individual level? Were they focused on the family level? And ultimately, was that action leading to a change of policy or a change of behavior, et cetera? So we're doing a lot of crossing and back and forth, and certainly it's not entirely comprehensive. It's as much as we can identify and then engaging with the actors on the field. But basically putting that together and looking at each of the different milestones. So again, like later on in change of policy, you see in 2011, the Colombia government passes the Victims Law. This was essential for children specifically on child recruitment and ensuring that they had services, et cetera. And there was, the development of, the policy around that then would lead to the, various departments around the country to be able to respond. So again, there's quite a few there. In addition, you can see the change in attitude in terms of what we were able to capture. So for example, you might have seen different armed groups like the FARC making an actual statement now that they will no longer recruit children under the age of 16. Okay, so that's an actual change in attitude. Whether that leads in behavior or practice is a whole other thing, but the fact that that actually happened is significant, and we want to capture that. And then we want to capture that again as it relates to, did that actually have a change in vulnerability, capacity, and threat in order to be able to actually reduce the risk? So each of these, it's very comprehensive and it takes a lot of work, but it's actually fascinating to see. So we did this, and we did this in engaging the actors on the ground to do this along with us. And again, we looked at change in practice, change in behavior. And I'm not going to go through all the examples, but we're also capturing the negative. So it's not just the positive that happens. There are also negative changes of behavior and practice that take place too, that you have to kind of put into play to see whether or not that makes sense, or if it's actually creating change. And I'm going to talk about why it looks like certain milestones are, like, for example, change in behavior, there's really only a couple there. Whereas in change in policy, you saw a lot. And that's really evident then when you're in country in terms of where the effort is going. Where's all the work going towards, and where there's significant gaps in trying to address the attitudes or the behavior, the actual change in practice. And then you could follow this with the numbers, if you wanted to get to the prevalence issues, of the numbers of children being recruited at certain times throughout a timeline. And to see whether or not that was actually making a difference or not, or completely irrelevant, So this, it was just very interesting to kind of piece that together with the actors. And what we do then is, in a workshop, we have them start to think about their own causal logic around this. So if they are saying that they need to have a policy, we want to question them about why. Why do you need this new policy? How is that policy really going to change this behavior, this action, and how do you see that happening? So you have your policy, which you saw. Where are all of them pathways that link that policy to all of the other actions, and what actions are needed? And that could be just an action of building a relationship with another actor, so that that actor can raise an issue that you need to be raised in order for something else to create a new dynamic that can then change something else. So you can see how minute it is too in terms of thinking through it. But some of the overall findings that we saw that came out of Colombia, and the milestone kind of chart kind of shows you there, is that there was significant effort put on policy, and that's great. I mean, there was a lot of work there, and it's good work. But again, it was not mirrored in looking at the change in attitudes and change in behavior, and you could see that, pretty much everywhere you went. There was also the issue that they needed to better disaggregate the analysis down to the community-specific patterns of threat. It was still very general, and they were, even in our workshop, we had different activities for them to do to think through this. They didn't even want to get to the community-specific level, thinking that they could just look at the generalities. But then as they started to do the activity, they realized, oh, no, this is different. The patterns in this community about how children are used are very different because there are these different actors, and right next door in this community, there are other actors, and the patterns are different there. So how you solve that problem is going to be different, okay? And so that was something that we recognized and that they recognized themselves, and doing the exercises, that they could start to think a little bit more in terms of context specific. And that helps you then develop context specific indicators. So the very specific, if you have that general indicator and the national indicators, as much as they're helpful sometimes for our donors and others and headquarters, they don't actually help those on the ground who are actually engaged trying to problem solve. So what are those specific indicators you can use to see the specific patterns in terms of change in vulnerability, capacity, and threat? A third piece was, and this is what I was trying to get at before, there was, while there's a rationale that surrounds the program, that context-specific causal logic was missing. Many organizations nowadays have theories of change, big theories of change, but they're very big and broad. They don't go all the way down to a particular context. And what we've identified in results-based protection is that your causal logic, your theory of change for your organization still needs to be broken all the way down, because it could be very different for one country, one community, than it is for another country. So that still was missing, that basically underlined their overall response. A fourth piece was then, and this was really interesting to us, is that because there were so many generalities, and this builds off of the idea of that, well, of course, if you have more children in school, they won't actually be recruited by the armed groups. This was an assumption that was made, so everyone was developing education programs, which is great. But they weren't actually measuring whether or not those programs were reducing the recruitment of child into armed forces. They were measuring education outcomes. So it was just a slight thing that they could actually switch to say, how are we designing these programs, and whether or not they could actually be linked to our measurement of reduction of children being recruited. At the same time, because they had those generalities, they were also missing a key piece. So certainly if you had child recruitment as one, well, if children are in school, then they're not going to be with the armed groups. But now a new pattern has emerged. Children are being used by armed groups. So they're being used maybe one day or maybe 2 hours to be a spy, to carry something over a border, right? So they're still in school, but they're still being used by armed groups. Did you catch that pattern? Usually not, because there wasn't enough analysis going on, and there were too many generalities to be able to say whether or not your program was actually fit to actually solve the problem. And thinking about those assumptions, et cetera. So this was really eye-opening, I think, for them and for us as well, to see, you know, how valuable it is to really get down to the minute details. Another key piece was the need for multiple actors, the contribution of multiple actors. And while there were opportunities there, certainly they were in the process of trying to engage new actors. There was a need for more of it, particularly on the peace building front. Just I think just a little bit of engagement right now, but you could see the potential for having more, and where that could go and how that could really change the reduction of risk for some of the children. And I mentioned this again. There were a lot of generalities around focusing in on vulnerability and capacity, and that's, I think, where most of the effort was going. But most humanitarians completely ignored the threat component of risk. And this is significant because, again, all three are needed. What we often heard is that, well, we don't do the threat. We can't do it. We're humanitarian. We're neutral. We're independent. We can't talk to these armed groups. And again, you have the Colombian government will kick us out of the country if we do this. So the threat was ignored entirely. They weren't even really analyzing it to the point to say, well, who could address the threat? What is the pathway to address the threat? How are we monitoring and measuring that so that we know whether or not it comes together, all of these pieces that we're all doing together to be able to actually reduce risk? So it was quite interesting for us to see, and recognizing that they did need to look at multiple pathways to be able to address the threat. And then I'm going to show you a graph right after this, and then I'll finish and allow you guys to respond. But what we did find significantly, and I think you find this across the globe, wherever there is a crisis, is that communities will always find solutions. And they will always be trying to prevent and actually address the threat head on. But whether or not we as actors actually engage, well, first identify those and build on those with the communities or not to be able to help them. If it is the communities that are going to address the threat, how do we actually support them to do that? And that's often missing. And what we found through our exercises and engagement is just a quick snapshot in terms of how humanitarians and government address risk. Again, our focus primarily, 40% of our efforts are focused on vulnerability and trying to reduce vulnerability, whereas 43% is focused on capacity. And only a small fraction there, 10%, is looking at the threat component. Doesn't mean we're not doing it, just means it's very small in terms of the way we're thinking and trying to address it. Whereas then look at the community. 50% of the efforts, they are addressing the threat. And it's an opportunity for us to kind of re-look at this. What are they doing that we're not doing? How can we build on that? How can we strengthen that? And they are certainly still trying to address vulnerability and capacity at the same time, but they are taking on a much bigger piece of reduction of risk, those three components, than we are ourselves. And so, again, it was an opportunity for them to kind of rethink, reflect on their approaches, and think about building on community-based protection mechanisms, strengthening that, identifying them in a very contextual way so that you could actually solve a problem. So I'm just going to stop there. That was our example from Colombia. I think that was my last. Yeah. And just, I mean, I can speak a little bit more in terms of what we were able to identify in terms of actual examples of good element, like the use of the elements, and maybe build on the question of the reflection piece. So this doesn't actually come from Colombia, because I don't know if we would say there was a lot of reflection in Colombia. What would you say?
Not that we saw specifically.
Yeah, we did. I mean, one of our best examples actually comes from Search for Common Ground in Lebanon, around the issue of how are you using reflection? And the idea within that office, particularly in Lebanon, was using reflection journals and thinking through empowering your national staff, local staff, your community mobilizers, your managers, everybody with these reflective journals on a daily basis that allows, and they're so close to the problems, and allowing them to reflect and empowering them to make decisions versus having decisions always being made at the headquarter level or the national director level, but really saying, well, no, it doesn't make sense for us to do 3 trainings on this issue because it has nothing to do anymore. The situation has changed entirely, and I can see this based off of like engaging and the reflection that they've been doing. They've been capturing it on a day-to-day basis, and that has then allowed them to adapt their programs immediately to then actually have a program that makes sense and is addressing a problem versus just reporting to the donor. So that was one example that we always build on. But I'm sure that there were several others. But I'll just stop there. But there were definitely lots of interesting things that I think about from our work. Questions?
Yes. It's kind of funny how timely your talk is. Somebody from Colombia was in our offices last week saying, and I'm saying, well, there's peace now, so what recruitment are you talking about? They're like, oh, everybody's back, and those illegal armed groups are recruiting, and the East and the Afro-Colombian tribes are particularly affected, and it was all kind of amazing news. So just that. Thank you for the update. I thought maybe you were going to be like a case study of how it's over now, but no. It's not.
And actually, one of the key findings, and again, we didn't go through all the details, but a core finding when you're on the ground, especially there, they're saying, you do have all these other paramilitary groups that even when you have peace, if you don't have government presence in some of these areas, these paramilitaries will come straight in, and these are ones that are already recruiting children, they're already engaging them, and that will continue. And they don't abide by all the international norms and policies and everything that have been set. So how is that happening? And so as you start to think about it, it's like, okay, so you need government presence, and that's what people say. But how do you get government presence there? So if you're not thinking about what it takes to get the government there to stay there, because the communities don't trust the government, then how do you build the trust? And then, so this is why we constantly think, well, where's the peace builders? Where is our engagement with those other actors, so that we can also work together to help solve that problem, to reduce the risk of children being recruited. So this is why, yeah, it was quite fascinating.
Charlie, a question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I am part of the Peacebuilding community, and I basically work with young people, and preventing them from violent extremism and promoting them to become peace builders. Just like Saji said, it's so related. It seems as if it's the same thing. The first thing I want to know is the age group of these young people you work with. I work in Africa, I work in a typical African perspective. And I will want to ask that, how do you manage protection without solving the things which makes these young people being recruited? For example, in peace building, when we are talking about interdisciplinary approach in peace building, what we are saying is, while we want to prevent violent extremism, we are solving these problems that are making young people vulnerable. For example, in a typical African context, we have social exclusion, for example, that can put you at risk, or unemployment. So in our work, when we are bringing in interdisciplinary approaches, we are bringing in other groups of people in the community who can solve this problem. That's a prevention strategy which we are using. So I don't know if in humanitarian action, in the protection program, this is the approach which you take. And as if we look at this perspective so clearly, it's all about complementing. I am speaking from a huge experience living of violence and radicalization. I lived it, I understand what it means. I did not study on books, I know what it means. So when working with this group of people, I work with street children, I work with young people who have a history of violence. And this is the approach which we are using, and it works so well. So I don't know if in the line of your work, we could build more groundwork and the research to make it more effective and to have better results.
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach for results-based protection is that it's engaging multiple actors, including children, youth themselves, in thinking through the problems and thinking through what does it take. And they're looking, again, they're breaking it down. They should be breaking it down in terms of what are the vulnerabilities, what are the capacities, what are the threats, and looking and addressing each one of those. And as you start to do that, and what we often found in the Colombia context, for example, was that there was this need saying, well, they're moving towards, boys particularly of this age group are moving towards engaging certain groups because they don't have any other opportunities. There aren't livelihood opportunities, or they're not in school, etc. So you hear that a lot, and it was there on the ground, and everybody was recognizing that. But it often stops there, and they don't go beyond that. So, and oftentimes it's very general. So you have, these general programs of, well, we all need education, we all need livelihoods, but it's not so specific. And so the approach for results-based protection is to try to help people narrow down a little bit, engage those that are part of it, the people themselves, in coming up with those solutions and empowering them as well to be able to identify what would work, what wouldn't work, and then crossing over to see the multiple sectors that also can engage. So beyond the humanitarians, maybe they can only go so far, but what about the peace builders? What about development actors that are able to invest? What about the private sector? Where's the private sector? If we've identified livelihoods as a critical factor that's looking at vulnerability and why children still go towards one direction, because there's no job opportunities, well, how do you build those jobs? So bringing in other actors to think through and to problem solve together. So I think it very much gets to what you're talking about in terms of a problem solving approach, engaging multiple actors, and not just coming in with our own preset ideas and activities.
Second question, you talk a lot about policy as one of the major successes in your work. And I want to take again a typical African context where at times policies are just paperwork and has no use. Policies are made, they are not enforced, there's no money to support it. What would you do as a researcher, as an expert in this domain? What would you do in a context of this nature where these policies are made, but nothing is done on the ground, no implementation, no money to support it? What would you do? What would you advise?
For me, I mean, this is why we brought it straight back to Colombia. This is exactly the example that was for them. they focused a lot on policy. I mean, that's where all the effort went in. And at the end of the day, though, everybody on the ground was saying those policies are not having an actual practical change. There's no practice, there's no behavior change, there's no attitudes, the policy's there, it's beautiful on paper, but it's not happening. And so for us, the way we engage then is to have them think differently and ask different questions and to just change their mind just slightly to say, well, what would it take then to implement that policy? Who needs to be there? What actors can help shape this? What's happening in the community? What's happening around the community? Who's there? Who's not there? Who should be there? And really, a results-based approach is really asking questions. It's basic problem solving and just helping guide almost a new approach. And then as you start to come up with ideas, you are then putting that against your timeline or your causal logic. And you're looking at your assumptions around that. So if you say, well, there needs to be research or there needs to be evidence that proves that, why? And we'd say, why? And we'd question them. And you would say, well, where is the evidence already? Does it show it in another country context? Would it apply here? If so, okay, well, let's test that out a little bit. How is that relevant to this place here? Or is there something else that's missing? So it's constantly putting something down as part of your that causal logic, but it's questioning your assumptions around it. And what we found in Colombia, it was actually difficult for them to question their assumptions, even. And so even that can be a struggle. So it depends on how you engage people, how open, how trustworthy you are. I mean, a lot of these things that come from the peacebuilding community, I think, are extremely valuable in thinking about trust, et cetera. To think about, well, you know, this is your assumption that this is what actually, and even from the community themselves, they were saying this is what has to happen. But even all of the things that they said should happen, it still wasn't creating the change. So how do you even get communities themselves to think differently and just to question their ideas too? So I think we always go in with that idea of questioning and just helping guide a process versus coming up with the answers. So I never would have a solution for any context without engaging those that are already there.
Great. Well, we have one more question that's come in from one of our online viewers. Maybe we'll try to keep it brief though, so we can move to the group discussion. So Jason Hart, he is tuning in from the University of Bath. He's also a research associate at the University of Oxford Refugee Study Center. His question is, my question is about implementation, where the main source of threat to children is from the government. If you challenge government, are you violating the principle of neutrality? If you fail to do so, are you violating the principle of accountability to locals who want you to take a stand? In addition, what if your donor doesn't want you to challenge the government? What happens to the principle of independence if you follow your donor government's line?
Yeah. All things that we would say build into that, the causal logic in terms of your action. One of the things that came out of Colombia, again, we were told that they could not address the threat because that would be against neutrality, the principle of neutrality, the principle of independence and impartiality, etc. And we challenged them back to say, well, is it? Speaking to non-state armed groups is not against the principle of neutrality. There's nothing wrong with speaking to somebody. We do that all the time. We do that to gain access to a location where armed groups are in control of. We speak to them all the time. And so a little bit it was challenging them back is to reflect on those principles, what is at the heart of those principles, and what can humanitarians do. So I would probably say it would depend on each context, but you would need to look at, in terms of your engagement with the government, how far does that go? I do think sometimes it can be a struggle, particularly like in a context like Lebanon, where we were, as another example, where you did have the government of Lebanon sitting in the protection working group and making decisions. Now that's, you know, and they could not get out of that. So how do you deal with that then? So that goes on to your causal logic then. That is a problem that you need to solve, right? You need to start to break that down to think, what are the challenges around that? How does that impact our programming in order to be able to do something? And break it down to the various pathways and identify the different key actors that are necessary then to engage with the government versus the humanitarians, for example. And so I think that's the piece that we have these big assumptions and these statements out there, but if you break down the problem, you can actually find solutions quicker.
Great, thank you.
Rachel, can I? to interrupt. I just have one comment, I think, just to build on Jason's question a little bit as well. Jessica, I understand the causal logic here and the context-specific responses that are important. But I just I was really fascinated by one of the slides you showed. You talked a little bit about 47, on the humanitarian side, 47% of the people think of vulnerability, whereas in the community level, it's 25% who think it's vulnerable, can be vulnerable. And I want to speak about it this way. As humanitarians, oftentimes we are sometimes the international actors, and as international actors, and sometimes as local actors, we have certain assumptions we use when we think of vulnerability. When we look at children, we think of children as often victims, and they need the protection and guidance and support. Sometimes we think of them as actual positive agents who also can shape the situation as well. So that's one second. The other sense of vulnerability is the assumption that from a government side is that they need more protection, but they also need more security. And the securitized approach comes into play because of the vulnerability they have and the threat that it can cause. So I think in this environment, beyond the protection issues, the issue of participation, I think, is really important. But the assumption we use around this cannot be just as children as victims or young people as victims or young people as a threat in the society. So I think we need, if we remove that out and see them as agents who actually can shape this society, there's a lot of evidence now coming that young people engaged in these efforts can actually help in reducing tension also, them being involved in the reduction of tension itself. So I think before you break out, I think that's important to put it in that context discussion also. Over.
Thank you, Saji.
I hate to do this as well, but I have one comment. I would just say that I think it's really important, speaking from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, that everything you're talking about being responsive and collaborative and participatory is so important, but that also has to happen at the beginning. You have to design for that. And that might mean a conversation with your donor, but like what you're also saying about trying to get both your participants and local partners to think differently, that could mean building in from the beginning reflective practice, which means that could be something as simple as saying, all right, every month we're going to have this meeting and we're going to talk about how it's going. But those mechanisms for reflection and for getting different input, they have to have accompanying mechanisms for response, because I think that there's a huge issue there, which actually becomes almost an ethical issue. If you're getting different responses and you're not able to act on them, if you're not able to actively respond to them, you're going to lose buy-in. And and you're also you're losing a lot of opportunity there for doing better work. And so I just think that it's really important to think about not just that, yes, being responsive is so important, but how do you actually operationalize that? And that has to start from a beginning intention at the design phase.
Yeah, and we didn't get into all the methods.
Yeah.
Peace are a key element, but that would fall under the core element of outcome-oriented methods. And just so you do know, is if you didn't get it already, there is a handout that is what we call our framework for results-based protection, and then we describe each of the elements in detail and talk about some of these key pieces that are essential in order to do this type of work.
Okay, so let's go to the questions that you had wanted to discuss.
So I actually say that one of the things that we wanted to do, as I said, we are still learning through results-based protection and still shaping and understanding what works, what doesn't work. And it's also an opportunity to kind of get you all to participate in that and help us reflect on some pieces of work. So we had the idea of having two groups and be able to think through each of those groups to think about one different question and then one common question together. And it will be interesting to see some of various perspectives in the room, whether you come from the humanitarian world or the peacebuilding world or the academic world, but your thoughts and perspectives on this. So just to share briefly with the what our questions are. Our first question, and this really gets at the measurement kind of piece and looking at indicators, but as I had said, the results-based approach to protection emphasizes a need to be able to disaggregate those very specific patterns of risk, so threat, vulnerability, capacity, in order to actually see change. But those global and national indicators can often prove then ineffective in measuring results and actually being able to be adaptive and responsive immediately. They don't help with decision making all the time. So in this group, we would love to hear, and I feel like this is both in the peace building world and the protection community. So it would be interesting to hear from your perspectives what opportunities and methods are used then to overcome these challenges or barriers, particularly as it relates to indicators. So how are you using indicators in the field, or are you still focused on national, these global indicators, or how can you make them more contextualized so that they actually help the program? That's the first question. The second question then really builds on the issue of community-based protection. And this is the core, I would say, of results-based protection, because we're beginning always from the perspective of the affected population and trying to understand what they're already doing to protect themselves. And I think that I would assume this would be happening from the peace building lens as well, understanding what people are already doing to deal with trust issues or conflict in a community. How are they handling that? So it would be good to be able to share from both of our perspectives the opportunities, the methods that are used, and the challenges that each of us see in trying to identify and support community-based protection better. And then the last question, which we hope that both of the groups were able to discuss, then is really about that contribution and the collaboration. So for us, again, to achieve a protection outcome, you need to have multiple actors, multiple disciplinaries across multiple levels, and then find that complementarity between each of our roles. So what are the relationships, the boundaries, the synergies between humanitarian actors and peace builders? And are there examples that you know of that can illustrate that and help us understand better so we can problem solve better together and address, in this context, child protection issues on the ground? So we'd love to have two groups, each take one, and then also answer the third one. And then do you want to explain online? If there's some?
Yeah, sure. So anyone who's participating online, you can look through the questions and send in your comments, which we'll share with the group sharing section. So now I think we had said perhaps it would make sense to have everyone raise their hand on the peace building side and then on the humanitarian side, and we'll just kind of try to divvy it up into two groups. So, okay, who's on the peace building side of the community? Here? Okay. 3, 4, great. Okay, so do you two, Achaleke, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. Okay, would you like to be part of one group, and then you two here can be part of one group? Okay, and then humanitarian side, should we just go ahead and split it up? Yeah. Go to who you're nearest to. So we'll have Achaleke's group at that side. And Alice, yeah, you would prefer that?
Well, it might solve the discussion if it's not.
Yeah, it's. What question? Yeah, so how about question 1, group 1? Yeah, so I think you're with this group. Well, group 1, go to the adjoining room, the small conference room.
About, what,
Yeah.
10 minutes, 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think just 10 to 15 minutes maximum.
Okay.
Can everyone be back here at 11:40? That sounds fair?
Okay.
Yep. Oh, yeah, sorry, it's written on the board, 8522. Yeah.
I do it.
So actually, you're with the group 1.
Who's saying, is this your group?
This is group 2. Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I should have pointed that out. Yeah.
I'll get that in the indicator.
Oh, okay.
So you're gonna.
How are you doing? Good, thanks.
Okay.
So you
Okay.
had a good trip to Colombia?
Yeah, it was great.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
sorry
excellent.
about that.
Yeah,
No, it's okay.
definitely our best trip so far.
Oh,
We
really?
learned a lot,
The
so
entire
Yeah.
it was really interesting.
And you were able to talk to Pravash and our team that.
Yeah, so the team came to our roundtable and
Oh,
we
did
talked.
Yeah.
So it was great to have them there.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, for sure. So it looks like we mostly have the humanitarian side here represented, but, so you'll be looking at the second question. I think the other peace builder, Ella, had to step away.
You want to take the lead?
I mean, so to give a little bit of background on this question, it's something that we have struggled with in recognizing how we can build on community-based protection. And I think, at least from our experience, I work with Jessica at Interaction on Results-Based Protection, and in a lot of our consultations, I mean, the humanitarians working on the ground have a really good sense or have an idea of what communities are doing for themselves. And one of the things that we've struggled to really recognize is how their programs might be able to build on that. And I think that there's a lot of discussion and engagement with communities, obviously, in the field. But what we have really been looking at is how are we building on that? And that's one of the things that we're really looking at, because all of results-based protection is looking at how you're starting with the community, how you're starting with the affected population, and how you're kind of building on what they're already doing. And I think the graph that she showed was really indicative of one thing that we saw, in that it wasn't necessarily the amount of activities that were being done to address threat, vulnerability, and capacity, but it was the ways in which the activities were structured. And it was really eye-opening, I think, for at least the humanitarians when we presented that same graph to them, was looking at how communities are addressing threat themselves. And maybe linking, they were doing a lot of community building and social cohesion programs, but recognizing how that may help communities to address the threat themselves. And I think that that was a really interesting thing that we were able to see in Colombia, and what we would be looking for elsewhere. So just, I think what we're trying to get at from this question is how are your organizations, or how have you seen that kind of happening in the field? What are the challenges to doing that? What are the where might the opportunities be? So I think that's kind of the background on the question. So I'd be interested to hear from your perspectives and in your experience where you might have seen kind of where that worked or where that didn't work.
You know how you're never sure what part of the elephant you're touching. So I work a lot in mental health and mental health with kids, and trauma and torture and in conflict. And two areas we're being challenged in now is, one, to work with the transitional justice people, so kind of seeing what the communities are doing to kind of adjudicate violence against children. And it's just really hard to understand and very not what we usually do, but that's an area that we're kind of looking into. And secondly, I'll say, in looking at how to treat kids who have been traumatized and tortured, the advanced work in kind of working with communities to define what constitutes mental health takes a long time to figure out. You know, just what the definition is, or how is depression or anxiety expressed, all that design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation work that makes up research, again, taking up a lot of our time, but it seems to be all about advanced work. Again, hard to hard when you're on the ground setting up a program to get that time and money to invest in what those community standards are, but everything I'm hearing is it's so necessary.
We all live in the United States. I'm from Canada originally, and these are two countries that can't even get a grasp on mental health and PTSD. So like just to take from that point that we can't manage it here, and we have reasonably good governments, perhaps, and structures and infrastructure. Canada has a better healthcare system than the US. But even so, so just taking that into account, trying to then get that going in a conflict situation, it's a huge undertaking.
To build on to the MHPSS element of it, my experience in Jordan, especially since in that context, refugees it's nearly impossible for them to get work permits. And if they do try to work and are caught, then they can face detention, forced relocation to the camps, or possibly deportation. And so a lot of them, especially if they don't have legal documentation to be outside of the camps, they will do anything that they can to make money. And oftentimes that means being asked or asking to access MHPSS services with the understanding that they'll get $4 or 4 JDs per time for transportation to go, which then clogs the system, and it makes it so that it's I mean, obviously the MHPSS service providers, they do assessments to try to determine who's got the highest priority and who's low priority. But I think that gets at the fact that oftentimes it takes a lot of interaction with different humanitarian actors, and as was mentioned before, the people on the ground to get to the real issues. Sometimes it's access to basic services, and sometimes it means it's a legal protection response to make sure that they can get the documentation so that they can be outside the camps without fear. And then, of course, there's access to other services that they need. But I was going to say that sometimes, because we had a community center in Amman, and we had a steering committee made up of the combination of the host community, Jordanians and Syrians, and we asked them what they would like, what they would enjoy, what would bring them to the center, the community center. And overwhelmingly, one of the responses was they wanted to have a beauty parlor, hairdressing, these sorts of activities. It's common in a lot of different countries. We did that, but then we found out later, after a bit of coordinating with other actors, that these sorts of service professions are on the closed professions list. So if they get caught doing this, then that again exposes them to legal risk. And so that made it clear to us that we had to not just provide immediate services, we have to do more advocacy, awareness raising, so that a lot of actors and donors engage with the local authorities to really address what are the core issues underneath all of it.
So when we are trying to work with girls and trying to empower girls, especially in humanitarian situations, I mean, I think a key tools that we're constantly doing is one, reaching out to the girls, talking to the girls, finding out their problems, but also figuring out their stakeholders, their immediate stakeholders, both men, women, community leaders at various levels of how they support that girl. And then do asset mapping so that we can understand, not just what the problems are, because I think we constantly get sunk into these are the problems, these are the barriers, and we don't look at, well, what is actually out there that is, that they have access to, and that we can build off of that. And then hopefully get a new platform where they have more assets, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the ways we do that is also looking at this this new model that we're testing out called Clara. I mean, I can read it out too, but it is like cohort livelihood something. But basically the idea is to then go back and talk about, if we want to go talk about livelihoods, because that always seems to be, the discussion always seems to go back to livelihood. We're in this position because we have no money. Like, again, talking to the girls, talking to their parents, talking to their brothers, talking to, the people around them, basically about what are the things that girls would like to do. So each of them, as far as the livelihoods, and what are the safety issues around them, so that we understand, like, well, yeah, it'd be great to go and do hairdressing, and then that's what the girls want. But then when you talk to the parents will say, well, we do, but in northern Nigeria, we don't want to let our girls go because we're worried they're going to get kidnapped. And so they think it's a great idea, but then you start seeing where the barriers are. And so then we just, again, trying to figure out, like, what is the best angle to get girls to, access to livelihoods. Yeah.
Before they get to that stage, they need to have some education. And just rolling out educational programs in refugee camps or in humanitarian crises is hard enough, but also if their parents don't have education, then they can't help them. So it needs to be much more broad than just the girls and the boys. Like if they're given books in a refugee camp, but the parents can't read them to the kids and whatnot, like, yeah, you can point at pictures and say this is a tree or what have you, but it needs to be much more broad.
I think one of the questions that we would have then is that, so yeah, you guys were talking a lot about how you're getting the perspectives on actions that we should be doing. And I think one of the questions that we have is, how are you recognizing the actions that, positive or negative, that the girls or whomever is already doing for themselves, or that families are doing, or that communities are doing? And how are we kind of understanding that and either trying to promote the good ones or mitigate the bad ones? And how can we kind of build that into our programming? And is that something that Peacebuilding struggles with as well? Or understanding that at the community level?
Yeah. I'll give you an example. And like I said, I use the use of sport for children, youth, and armed conflict. And I was working in northern Uganda at the height of the conflict all the way through till the present. So we've been steadily there for over 10 years. And when I say we, myself and my local team and everything. So one of the things that we wanted to do was, after a lot of research and field-based research and stuff that we did, we wanted to bring it back. We produced a lot of different results and stuff from the research, and out of that came the idea that especially from the abducted children and youth were still considered, they had that social exclusion, and they were considered principal threats to community peace, regardless of even knowing them or whatever, that they were threats to peace within the community just because of their former affiliation with the LRA. And that came out of the community also, and so, which was very important. We decided to look at, okay, well, how then can you use sport in this case? Where would it be part of holistic programming or standalone programming, or how would we be able to do this? We identified within that, what would the principal threat to peace look like, and does sport facilitate that, unfortunately, or does it resolve it also? And so we brought together a lot of the identified community-based sport coaches and sport teachers, and then we also had youth, and that came a little bit separately. But what we did was we had these little workshops, and we did free listing exercises of the community, the participatory research methods. Out of that, and we did it I was in English, but we wanted the outcomes to come in Luau. To be really understood. We translated it back to English, but then we took a further step and we translated it back to Luau. Again, just to clarify what we had come up with, and I did a presentation here sometime last year, and so that we had 4 levels of conflict that were identified, and so through the community, through these individuals, to be able to identify from simple arguments all the way, simple disagreements, all the way through what we would have never recognized, what we call the harmful level, or it's called Jimbarach in Luau, and a marking, if you will, or you killed my brother, or you killed or you torched my village, and you're on the opposite team, and you're waiting to mark that individual and stuff to do harm to them through the sport. And so things that, and then we actually went out, the sport teachers and coaches took us out, and we actually saw these things, and so within the sport. So we identified that. That was very important, to have these locally derived levels conflict within, that was happening, within the sport. Then the second part came, how do you resolve it? How do you work to resolve it and stuff? And again, it came through the participatory research methods and stuff. We can sit there and explore rock, paper, scissors all you want. They don't understand that, so, it doesn't work that way. And so we looked at how to do everything through simple resolutions all the way through community mediation. And so at that harmful level, so do you remove the individual from the sport? At the time, for how long a period, and so is there reconciliation between the two if there's a physical confrontation, and then allowing them back to play, things like that. But then the dialogue around it also that, well, you standing up and pushing that player down, sport being the very public forum that it is, just again identified you as that principal threat to peace within your community by doing that. And so how can, so we looked to how can you transfer that to the homeschooling community also. So all that was done at the community level to help identify that and then roll it out with the sport teachers and coaches. And the youth contributed also. They told us about, what they engaged in, or we had scenarios and things like that, how would you react in this situation? And it did connect to those levels of conflict in sport. And so then how to be able to resolve it within the cultural context. And so then how does that, we looked at that, how does that, connect to the social inclusion piece, the protective piece, and things like that also. So that was all done at it came out of the community. It didn't come out of me. And so it came out of, I just facilitated it and so with my team and stuff. So that's, I don't know if that's a great example or not and everything, but we wanted to look at how it could, and then how could it sustain itself also within it as an educational program also, which is what we've been working on.
Yeah.
And then from that came like being able to chart certain incidences, what was happening, when was it happening, and we were able to identify, for instance, how, during these high levels of sport participation, like during they call the primary level games there, or the Coca-Cola games and stuff, we started seeing a spike. So how can you be able to work towards preventing it around those and helping scaling up maybe your
Yeah.
I don't know if that's.
Did you do it in like all the languages? I mean, you did that or totally like that?
Yeah.
Was it primarily boys and what age group?
No, it was boys. Matter of fact, we were 51-49. Yeah, gender.
No. So now we'll have the group share back. So who would like to share for group one?
A couple spokespeople.
Okay.
We were in group one with the indicators. Sure. One thing you mentioned was, so at Child Fund, we do have some global and national indicators for measuring community-based child protection capacity in the development space. And so we're still working on how to get those into the humanitarian space. But on the project side, in the child protection emergency project side, we'll have indicators for measuring. We have one right now in Project Lord. I have worked that together on measuring child protection knowledge among community-based village level, valley level child protection actors and emergency task force members. And just from coming back, and that's in Ethiopia right now, coming back from on the ground, I think it will be one challenge is how can we use those indicators to make most sense to those communities on the ground to be being back on if that is building our capacity to respond to the situation. So I think making it real for the communities is our challenge.
And you had an example working with street children in relation to that first question. Did you want to quickly describe that?
In our conversation, I shared an example of how we engage with a group of young people. We have street children and the approach which we use. But for us to get all these indicators, it's very necessary on how you get to them. For example, we had this challenge where there was a rumor that street children were recruited by the Boko Haram, and the government was taking action without asking why, without knowing what's going on. So as from a peace building perspective, we had to organize a dialogue with them, where we had over 200 of them, but not just with them, but bringing in other civil society activists from different perspectives. Because for us to get this information, we need to bring people from other development fields. So in the course of this dialogue we had with them, we were able to know a lot about what they are doing, what is wrong, what they are doing, and what we can add. So it was a groundwork example to see how we can better get indicators, how we can better intervene in situations of violence, in situations of protection. So that was the example we had.
Any other comments from group one?
We also very quickly addressed the very last question on thinking through collaboration and how we come together, the different groups of Peacebuilding or Humanitarian. And as much as we recognize that there was a need and there's potential, I think we also recognize that our structures that are in place, our systems that are in place, and sometimes just our own requirements from donors or our own organizations prevent us sometimes from coming together and collaborating together. So an example that I gave was, our cluster system, like the protection cluster, it's for specific members, right? Humanitarian members, and oftentimes development actors aren't invited to that, or peacebuilding actors don't engage in that. Or they may not know about it, they may not know how to engage. It also may be a different language, it may be totally foreign. So like even our systems and structures prevent collaboration. And so I think for us it was an idea to kind of think about and go away with is, well, how do we break that? How do we break that down a bit, even if we still have our systems in place to create better collaboration?
Okay, great. Group two.
Okay, I can go over what our group chatted about briefly, but feel free to jump in. So we looked at the question on community-based protection and how you're understanding communities at that level. So we started off with a quick discussion about mental health and how that's understood at the community level, and particularly even in the US or Canada, we kind of struggle with how we understand mental health, but how you're really understanding that from the community level, and understanding perhaps the transitional justice mechanisms and how they're understanding mental health. And then I think something else that was really interesting that came out was that how you're using some activities or participatory methods to really understand the stakeholders in the communities themselves. So whether it's talking to girls or families and understanding how they're engaging and addressing some of the issues that they're facing, and how things like a community center might be able to kind of inform your analysis and look at solutions that communities or individual stakeholders might be looking at themselves. And then I think one really interesting one was looking at how through a sports activity you could inform conflict analysis. So understanding different levels of conflict and then looking at within a specific cultural context how you might be able to address that, whether it's through a simple resolution or community reconciliation, but how really strong participatory methods can inform and adapt our programming addressing that. Anything else to add that I missed, group?
Nothing that you missed, but we did get a chance really to get to the last question.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to make a note that I brought this in just as an example for people to take a look at if they want after. It's one of those, well, there were some successes and some failures, but areas where it could be strengthened in Jordan, where the child protection and SGBV, and oftentimes those two overlap, actors, the specialists in the country, they did this mapping exercise where they provided this resource and guidelines in terms of how to interact with survivors of these different violations, and then where to refer them according to their location, the experience that they had and whatnot. And they gave trainings, and it wasn't just a training to check the box, but it was a training to strengthen networks, and they strengthened the networks very much between protection actors, which they themselves are quite siloed, but also other humanitarian actors in different sectors, and local police stations, hospitals, schools. The big gap that I see, or what there was missing, is outreach to the peacebuilding actors, because I think they just weren't even on the map in terms of considering who might have access to these individuals in a relationship, have built a relationship with these survivors, and then have them know where to refer those specific cases, especially after hearing of your case in Uganda. And, working with somebody who's working in this project, that would be very helpful. But anyway, I'll leave this just in case anyone's interested.
Well, I think we have time for just a few wrap-up remarks, but then we did want to get to the networking, sharing information about relevant events, reports, anything that you wanted to share with the group. So did one of you have something that you wanted to say to wrap up?
I'm sorry we weren't able to get into have our groups go longer to really talk about more examples, but what I even have seen in our discussion is that there's huge potential for the peacebuilding community and the humanitarian community to come together. We have similar challenges and similar methods that we're also using that I think we could share and learn from each other to solve a particular problem. So I hope this is the start of a great blossoming relationship. But no, I think it was quite valuable. But I wanted to share with you a little bit about some of our next steps for results-based protection so that you can engage with us as well and understand more of the work that we're doing. So we are in the process now of really trying to document good examples of how these elements are applied in practice. And so we will start to visit more countries and try to identify those. But we're also in the process of now designing what we're calling a learning network. So the way our structure has been, it's been fairly fluid, but we do have a steering group of 4 NGOs who are made up of DRC, NRC, Oxfam, and IRC. Oh, sorry, World Vision too. And that's been the core group that's helped us shape it and thinking through the issues. And now what we're moving more towards is a more formalized learning network that can open it up to more actors and allow us to actually start to use results-based approaches and share back in a more formalized way to capture that learning and so that we can document it and promote it and use it more often. So we're in that process. We don't expect the full learning network to begin probably until next year. But in the meantime, we are starting what we're calling, what are we calling it? Learning group of practitioners. Smaller, more informal kind of discussions that we will try to have on a regular basis, bringing in multiple different actors to just talk about an issue. So if we're talking about how do you engage with affected populations, what's the best way? How do you engage with youth? What are the methods that are being used that are results oriented that could actually lead to a protection outcome? Can we share what that looks like in the field? So having a smaller group and a discussion and be able to start the thinking before the full learning network begins. So that's one opportunity. If you're interested and want to engage with us, more than welcome to speak to me or Eileen about getting and participating in that. The other is that we continue to have our own webinars. So we're thankful that we're able to come here to Search for Common Ground and do this, but we also hold various webinars on key pieces of results-based protection. So we will have one in July. I don't have the date yet. Probably around the 14th, 15th of July, and it will focus specifically on what came out of Colombia. And we'll hopefully have a broader discussion as well. So we'll get into more depth in that one and probably have some of our colleagues in Colombia speak on that one. So that will be quite interesting. But we're also looking at measurement. We'll probably have a webinar down the road on measurement specifically, looking at indicators specifically. Probably innovation, something like that. So we have these webinars that follow, and we'll keep you informed and post through your network as well, so different actors can engage and participate. Anything else that I missed?
Well, it seems quite clear from the discussion that there's plenty of room for collaboration between humanitarian protection, child protection-oriented actors and the peacebuilding community. So you mentioned a very specific opportunity for interactions working group, and that would be one. But I would just suggest, encourage those of you from those different communities, to network, talk about that, find out how you can, in fact, begin to do that kind of collaboration. It seems like it has a lot of potential. So take it away. Just before we finish, we'd like to give a few minutes for any announcements. Anything coming up that's relevant to the issue of children, armed conflict, report that's coming out, consultant that's needed, event that's happening, etc. So is there anything that anybody would like to share with the group?
I think Saji wanted to share.
Great.
Okay, just hi, thank you so much, Rachel. I just want to make 3 announcements. I think one, I think Rachel will make the announcement for the June 16th event, but there are 2 additional events that are happening next week. One on the 5th, next week on Tuesday at USIP, on the 14th, we are actually organizing the UN agencies, civil society organization in partnership with the U.S. Institute for Peace, and public launch of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250. This resolution, for those who are not familiar, is the first time the Security Council has recognized young people not just as victims or troublemakers, but the need to engage them as partners in peace processes. They have been recognized at that level. And the public launch will happen at USIP on the 14th. If you go to the USIP website, you can find it. The second announcement is on the 13th, 14th, and 15th next week, the World Bank is organizing a youth summit. And on the 15th, there's a focus panel discussion on the role of young people in peace building and peace and security efforts. And one of the audience members, Achalakti, who is in the room, will also be a panelist at that event. And several of the UN people and others will be speaking about the role young people, specifically young people, adolescents, and youth play in conflict and fragile environments. Events that are happening next week at the World Bank and at U.S. Institute for Peace. Over.
Thank you, Saji.
So on the 16th, is there?
So on June 16, we will be having the next WNCAC event, which will be a webinar, and it will be focused on, we'll have 5 young people from Nigeria, India, Colombia, Morocco, and Syria calling in on GoToWebinar, and they're going to share their experiences with youth-led education initiatives. So they're actually leading education initiatives in their communities, and how those initiatives are not only contributing to better learning outcomes, but interestingly, how they're also building resilience within their communities.
So it will be a webinar. Are you encouraging anyone to come here? Or just...
It'll only be online, because all of the speakers will be online.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Any other announcements?
I have one. June 27th. We don't have a room yet. It's 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. somewhere in a Senate office building. So we'll try to send it out wider maybe. Child will be with World Vision and Save for a briefing on different findings on the Europe migrant crisis. Focused on child protection.
Great. Can we get announcements out to those on the list?
Yep, I can email those out after this meeting.
So I'm sure Rachel has the information. Great, well, thanks to everyone for coming. It was a very interesting, I think, highly relevant discussion today, and there are things that can be followed up on, and we can go beyond the words. So thanks everybody for coming, and go in peace.